Sure. I'll say first of all that, it really is an honor to be in your presence here. I know your choice servants of the Messiah, the Lord Jesus, and I just love meeting family. So this is a great beginning. And I also say that Yap and Aziza have brought a lot of color and enthusiasm to the regional directors that we meet once a week from the different regions, and they have been a huge asset. They're very encouraging, inspiring, even though we don't hear from you as much as I'd like to. But you got good company here. So I'm not sure. I know that Yap mentioned, or maybe it was Corey, mentioned sharing my testimony, and which I could do. I'd abbreviate it considerably, but the reason I would is because I really think it's important to get the context of really Isaiah chapter 40, what you said, because the name of the ministry that I'm the director of is called Comfort My People. So, that verse came when I was actually asked by the founder of A&M to begin ministry in Israel in 2014. So we officially kicked off that year. There was the 80th nation that A&M was working in. So you might say, why, if you're an international mission organization, why is Israel number 80? Because from what I remember reading in Romans, it says that to the Jew first, not 80th. So I didn't go into that conversation. I could have, but I always resist those conversations because they're just too frequent. But the honor and the opportunity was just overwhelming to me. So I told him, please give me 15 seconds so I can pray about this. And so 15 seconds later, I told him, actually, I didn't wait 15 seconds. I told him immediately that I'd be honored. It would be a privilege, even though I know nothing about doing something like that. I would love to do it. So we started then. But when I started, part of the thing, and I might have said this earlier to you guys last time, is part of what I had to do is to present to the leadership of A&M why Israel is a valid nation if our ministry is centered, focused completely upon reaching the unreached. Why would we go into Israel? Because there's no unreached in Israel. The Jews, how could the Jews be an unreached people group? And I said, that's a great question. And I'm glad you asked that, because if the Jews are if the authors of the Old Testament completely, the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, are all Jewish, and the writers of the New Testament are all Jewish except Luke, and actually contemporary scholars think that Luke most likely was Jewish. But regardless, so all these writers of the Bible, other than possibly one, are Jewish. All the prophets are Jewish. The kings were Jewish. The disciples were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish, the Messiah. How come they're an unreached people group? How is that possible? They should be the most reached people in the world. Well, the reality is people don't talk to Jews about their Messiah. And it's been that way for, as you said earlier, 19 centuries and counting. So when I was growing up, I was born in Brooklyn with many of your kinsmen, most likely, some of your relatives, because we were very segregated in Brooklyn. It was Irish neighborhood, Italian neighborhood, Jewish neighborhood, etc. Those are the big ones. And so you didn't really mingle that much in Brooklyn, but at an early age, my parents, along with a lot of other families from New York, moved to Long Island, which is east of New York City. And that's where I grew up. So no longer were you in a Jewish neighborhood, you were mixed, so everyone was mingling. And the Jews were a very small minority of those communities, the ones where I lived in. And so anti-Semitism was deeply embedded there before I got there. And I didn't know anything about that because I'm little. But one of the things that, the way I learned is because my parents and aunts and uncles, grandparents, no one talked about persecution. No one talked about the Nazis. No one talked about the pogroms. No one talked about everything that they had gone through because they all came from Europe. So my parents, my father was from Russia. My mother's family's from Poland, Eastern Poland. And so they were embedded in, not Nazism, fascism, communism, but the hatred for Jews was very long-standing. And they fled with many others for their lives. So they were able to get here before the Holocaust, but there's still members of our family that were there, distant to me. But so I had to learn about anti-Semitism in a personal way because no one wanted to talk about it. But we always knew, we meaning my brothers and sisters, we always knew that we were a hated people, that there were certain people we had to be careful about. We'd overhear them talking, they always had friends over, played pinochle and mahjong and things like that. And so I'd listen to their conversations from the other room, the adults. And so I'd know that there was some certain people you stayed away from, certain houses you didn't interact with, certain businesses you probably didn't want to deal with. So there was this suspicion that grew inside of me. But it wasn't until I was probably 8 or 9 years old when I first started to face it. Actually, I was younger, when we would go out to eat. So every week we would go out to a diner, which was kind of like a restaurant. I don't know if you have diners there, but very simple kind of eating. And I was intrigued by the bathrooms. This might sound weird, but in the bathrooms, in the bathroom stalls, there was graffiti. There was lots of graffiti. And the graffiti would be typically carved in with someone's knife or something sharp. And, sometimes it would be a magic marker, but every single stall that I ever can remember going to had Nazi signs in it. Usually lots of them were big ones. And with the Nazi signs came a slogan that was repeated, which said that kill the Jews, they killed Christ. And so that's what I grew up knowing about. And when I'd ask the question, I stopped asking at an early age because no one would answer. They'd say, we don't talk about that. We just don't talk about that. Just don't think about it. Don't worry about it. Get over it. And so that was it. I wouldn't talk, but it was internalized really deeply. And as I grew up, I learned more personally about anti-Semitism. I'd overhear things, especially when I'd be drinking with my Irish friends. When I was 16 in the bars, to frequent them even during the school weeks, be in the bar just about every night. And sooner or later, somebody said something about a Jew that would get me upset. And one time, I always overstep my boundaries, but that's what alcohol has a tendency of doing, making you think you're bigger than you are. But so I'd get into fights, and just because I was Jewish. Then when my father started realizing, some of my angers and, what it was about, he had a sit-down conversation with me, which was rare for him because he worked so many hours, that he changed his name from, when he was in Russia, the family name was Rabinowitz, and he changed it to Robbins because he got into fights because of his last name. And he didn't want his kids to get into fights. So the fights that he mostly got into, which he wouldn't get into details, was he was a soldier in World War II. He was in infantry for the whole war. But he would get into fights because he would be called a Jew and cursed out or whatever. And that's why we're fighting this war, because of your people. We're fighting because of you Jews. And so that would be because they knew his name. He was, it was right there on his lapel. So he didn't want his kids to go through the same thing. It didn't really work for me. It might have worked for my brothers and sister, but for me, I was more engaged in the culture. So I grew up, two things. One was Why do they hate us? Why are we hated? Why do they hate Jews? No one would answer the question, so I was left to think about it. The other question is, well, why are we here anyway? You know, what is this about, this life? You know, what's life about? What am I here for? Is it just to go to school? I didn't like school. If it was just to, you know, to get a good job, to make money and all that. And as I got older, I was like, I don't want money. I just want to have fun and enjoy life, but I want to know what I'm here for. And it can't be that either. So no one had the right answer for that. So I didn't see that in Judaism. I'd go to Hebrew school, like most of us did, the Jews, after school during the week. And then on the weekends, we'd have, when Christians were going to church, we would have tallis and tefillin school. It was really, because I don't know if you know what a tallis is or a tefillin, but the Orthodox wear that. It's part of ritual. So you learn how to do that, and you learn the prayers. Everything was rote. You didn't necessarily know what it means. You know, you speak in Hebrew, you pray in Hebrew, but you don't know what you're saying. So you really don't learn anything about anything except the big stories that most Christians learn in Sunday school, you know, the David and Goliath type stories. So that didn't really satisfy my thinking. So I grew up thinking that it could not be Judaism. The answer was not in Judaism. They don't have the answer. If they did, they're keeping it a secret because no one seems to live like they know why we're here. So I started discovery process, which was at the same time as the drug culture opened up in America in the late 60s and early 70s. And I became immersed. I became a hippie. You know, I don't know if you guys heard of Woodstock, but Woodstock and most of the, you know, I mean, it all came from you guys. It all came from London and Dublin. So we got your music. You're the cause of it all. We would have been in good shape until then. No, I'm kidding. But thanks for the Beatles, though. Appreciate that. We always like the Beatles. So I was really into that, fully immersed. It was my new culture. I was considered myself a citizen of Woodstock. That's what it was called, Woodstock Nation. And that's all that mattered to me. So I wanted to be a hippie. I wanted to live in a commune. And that was it. So I started discovering that process. But in the process, I had to come up with something that was giving significance to it. And it was pretty much of a gray area, being a hippie, because anything goes. And I didn't really see people that I thought had it together. They needed drugs to live life. And that to me was like, okay, so I do the same thing, but that's not, I need somebody in front of me, older than me, experienced by what life means. Because if it's all about drugs, then this is going to be a short-lived life because people were starting to die already from overdoses. So it couldn't be that. So I started studying the Eastern mysticism and getting pretty involved with different ones. I became deeply involved in yoga and stuff, and I became a yoga instructor, actually. By the time I got saved, I was a yoga instructor when I got saved. And that was in New York. But the day that happened, what I whittled it down to is that I would get married to my girlfriend. We were living together for 4 years or so by then. And we would get married, and then that would make sense out of life. I would start to have calm down, be able to settle into a skill as a carpenter, and we could go buy a piece of property, get a couple of goats and chickens, and have a few kids, and that would be life. That would be it. That's all I needed to know. And because I visited all the communes, by the way, and I didn't see any of them living the way that showed me that they knew the meaning of life. So I did a lot of stuff like that, traveling all over America, into Canada, across Canada, hitchhiking everywhere. I built a truck and put a camper on the back of it and lived in it for thousands of miles, and still never found anybody that knew the meaning of life. None of the communes had it down. And so I settled down to we'll just get a couple of chickens and some goats and some kids, and that's it. There can't be more than this. When it's over, it's over. But it still never satisfied me. I was still so upset all the time because it had to be more. So I was frustrated and angry. but now I'm a hippie, and hippies are supposed to be love, peace, and happiness. So I had this conflict going on inside of me. How could this be? But I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to keep going. So one day I'm working as a carpenter in the east side of Long Island, where the very wealthy live. And I'm a carpenter's helper. And my boss was a carpenter, very good carpenter. He was from Hungary. He moved to America to make a fortune. This is what he told me. He told us, never really talked to me personally, but he told us that he came to America to become a millionaire and go back to Hungary and build a house on the hill and laugh at everybody that he knew. That was his vision for life. So he was a very good carpenter, and I wanted to learn to be a good carpenter. So I stuck with him until I couldn't take it anymore. But he was also a communist, and he told me as well, he told me personally, he told somebody next to me, but telling me through somebody else, because he really never talked to me. He said, the only people he hates more than Americans are the Jews. So he made that very clear. So I'd have to get up every morning, because now I had a wife and a daughter, and my wife was pregnant with our second child. So I had to work for a living. I couldn't miss it, because we were living hand to mouth. So this one day I'm working, and it's lunchtime, and we sit down. We're in a house, in the basement of the house, and I'm sitting down there, and I never would sit with them, but I had to sit near him because he had to yell at me to tell me it was time to get up and go to work. So he didn't want me far away. So he was like that. I mean, he was really a communist dictator that I was working, that was disguised as a carpenter. But I needed the job and I wanted to learn, so that's why I stayed. So one day, he and the boss, the owner of the company we were working for, this millionaire builders, they're talking, and I'm sitting there on a bucket against the wall, maybe 10, 12 feet from them, and trying not to listen to them. But the builder says to my boss something I'd never heard anyone say before. And he said, out of the blue, Hitler was a wise man. And I stopped eating and I look up and I'm like, what did he say? And then my boss says to him, Hitler was a fool. And then I'm like, I think I'm like hearing these things because I'd never heard anyone talk like this. But my boss said Hitler was a fool. That's the smartest thing I'd ever heard him say. So I got interested and I said, maybe there's something about this boss I don't know about. And then the builder says to him, it was almost as if this was staged, and I believe it was staged, but it was like they rehearsed it. The owner of the company, the builder, says to my boss, why do you say he was a fool? He says, if Hitler was a smart man, he would have finished the job that he started. And when he said that, something happened inside of me that I still feel. And this is 1980, 79, 80, around there. I felt this rise of hatred. I hope you've never felt this, but I felt this rise of hatred coming up out of me. And in an instant, I planned the execution of my boss and the builder. And I mean, this is a real plan. It happened instantly. And there were two shovels leaning against the wall on the opposite of where I was sitting, but they were near where they were. It was behind the builder and my boss. And I was going to grab one shovel and hit my boss on the back of the head and kill him. I was going to grab the other shovel and hit the builder. I knew that I could take the builder without a problem, but my boss was a big, strong man, and I needed to be swift. And I planned this. It was like that. And as soon as I started to get up, he turns around and he looks at me and he screams at me, what are you doing? Get up and get back to work. And I knew it was too late. So I got up and I just felt this emptiness inside me. Not that I didn't kill him, but that I wanted to. And I didn't know that at first, what the emptiness was, but I felt that this hatred was my hatred. It wasn't anybody else's. And it was with me. When I got up, it was still there. It didn't go away. And I felt it all through the day. Anyway, it was a long ride home, and I got home that night, and I also had an infection on my hammer hand, right here on my finger, this finger. And I had a history of infections that would hospitalize me. I was very reactive to them. And this one was getting bad. And I'd had gangrene before, and I knew what it looked like. So this one was spreading from here all the way down my hand, and it was very large. It was like having another thumb on the top of my finger. And every time I touched anything, it was just agonizing. So anything I did to it, and I was pretty good at cutting them open and getting splinters out and stuff. But this one wasn't responding. I couldn't do anything. So I came home and I told my wife. I didn't tell her about the story. I didn't want her to know. But I told her the truth was that I thought I'd have to have my finger cut off because we couldn't afford to go to a doctor, and the emergency room was very cheap in those days. So I could just go to the emergency room and have it cut off, the top of my, half the finger cut off above the knuckle. And I could keep working. So she said to me the weirdest thing. So one day I heard the two weirdest things. First from my boss and the second from my wife. She said, "Why don't you ask Jesus to heal you?" I'm like, where did you get that from? Now, I didn't ask her that, but afterwards I was like, where did she get that from? But I just said, okay. And I just closed my eyes, and I really didn't know anything about doing that. But I had been reading the Bible and I have to go backwards to tell you this, but somebody had given us a Bible, a family Bible for our wedding. Now, we were not believers. We didn't have friends who were believers. But somebody had given us a family Bible. You know what I mean by a family Bible? It's like the size of a coffee table. It's gigantic. And you can't do anything with it. If you don't read it, you can't even put it on most shelves because it's so big and heavy. So, but we had it, and it had really incredible pictures in it. So it interested me, and I started looking at the pictures. But also, I started reading it, and as I'm reading it, I read through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and it still didn't make sense to me. I didn't get the cohesion to it. Do you know what the last two words are in the Hebrew Bible, by the way? The last word, anybody know what the last word? Now, it's going to say different in different versions, but the last word in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Malachi, is destruction. The second to the last word is utter destruction. So the book ends in utter destruction. Is that a good story? I mean, who wants to read a book that ends in utter destruction? Not me. And when I got done, I said, this can't be the whole story. So fortunately, in this family Bible, it continued on into Matthew. So that was my beginning of reading about Jesus. And I'm reading about him. Now, this comes up to the time where I'm confronted with my boss. I'm reading about him. And I'm like, I cannot believe this. He was actually Jewish. Jesus was a Jew. How come no one told me this? How did he get to be a Jew? And they hate us. Why did we kill him? Why would we kill one of us? So this whole, and I'm 29 years old, I'm not like in Sunday school, and I'm asking these questions to myself, to whoever will listen, in my mind. And I'm like, I don't understand this. How could this possibly be? If I knew Jesus, I would have hung out with him. He was an amazing guy. So, but I didn't have the answer for that. But I kept reading. So I'm up to the New Testament now when this all happens. So my wife telling me to ask Jesus to heal me is not that foreign to me, but she's not reading the same Bible. But she had some influence that made her think in those terms. So I did. I got out on the floor of our house, kitchen floor, and I just sat there against the wall, and I said, now my wife had no idea what happened that day. I said, God, this is all I remember saying. I said, God, I don't even know if you're real. This whole life has been so confusing to me. And Jesus, I had no idea who you are. But somehow I have a feeling that you are you have something to do with God if you're not God yourself. And that's all I remember saying. I don't remember saying anything by my hand, but it hurt like crazy. And I knew that something had to happen. Well, I don't know how long I was there, but my wife said, she called my name and she said, look at your finger, look at your finger. And I opened my eyes and my finger is pouring out. It's just oozing out this ugly infection that was stuck in there. And I'm feeling this pressure relieved from my hand. It was amazing. But at the same time, I realized that I had tears rolling down my face, and I was not a crier. I couldn't remember crying before that. But something else was happening, is that the same thing that was happening in my finger was happening in my heart. I felt that there was an infection in my heart that was being released. And I don't know what happened next that night, but I knew I woke up the next morning and I was born again. No one ever told me I must be born again. No one ever told me I had to come to an altar. I never heard Billy Graham's music in the background saying, come as you are. I just knew that I was a different person. And so I got up that morning and I went back to work, which shocked my boss to see me, because he expected me never to show up. That's what I understood from the next few days. So I could tell you more story about that. But he, that day, he didn't ask, he never asked me anything. He told me, and it wasn't the beginning of the day. I could tell he was really puzzled by seeing me, but later in that day, he said to me, if you want to work here anymore, you have to take a cut in pay, a $1 an hour cut in pay. Now, in those days, a dollar was a lot. I think I was making $5 an hour. So I was like, I can't see doing that. And because I thought I was worth more than that, and I really felt that I should, stand my ground. But I didn't, I wasn't definitive that day. He says, you think about it, you have 5 days to decide, and then you're fired. So being fired to me was a scary thought, because that's the only income we had. And so I went back and I worked, and he started pinpointing me to do certain jobs that were beyond belief. And I won't go into the details of them, but he was trying to get me to quit. And the reason is, in America, you have unemployment insurance if you're fired, but you don't have unemployment insurance if you quit. And I was told to this by his second in command, that there were 30 people that came before me that quit. He forced them to quit after working for a month or so. Then they would quit because they couldn't take him anymore. But so he pretty much worked people out of a job, and it would suit his purposes. So I said, I really felt God would give me something that I never had before, was a sense of perseverance. I didn't know the word even at the time, but I sensed that, no, I'm not going to quit. And so the last day, the 5th day, he singled me out, took me to another job to start building a horse barn for stables for these racehorses of some very wealthy judge on the east end of Long Island. So he started on one end and I started on the other end, and he told me we were going to just dig until we meet in the middle. And that was where he was going to kill me, he figured. And I would quit because it was grueling work and it was a very hot day. So I'm working, but I'm excited. I am enthusiastic about this day because I know it's my last day. And I can't wait to leave this guy's presence for the rest of my life. I just can't. But so I'm working as hard as I possibly can. And it's like God made the soil into, sand. It was just so easy. And I look over and I see him way down the other end of the line, and he's swatting things like this. He's going like this, and he's fighting as he's digging. And I'm digging, and I knew if I looked too much, he would do something. And I assumed he had planned to hit me over the head with a shovel and bury me in one of these holes. But because we were the only ones there, there was no one around for I don't know how far. But and anyway, so he's digging and he's swatting these things. As I get closer to him, I see that he has a swarm of nests, a swarm of gnats over his head. These tiny little bugs, and they're swarming him, and they're not on me. And I'm like, this is remarkable. And so as we get closer, the day goes on. I don't remember stopping for lunch, and we meet in the middle somewhere. He expected him to be me on like, right on the far right, and him right next to me, because he was a workhorse. This guy was built like a tractor and worked like one. And so we met in the middle, and I knew he was upset, but he just got up, he got out, and went to his truck. I went to mine and put my tools in, and went to his truck and stood outside because he had to give me a check. And he handed me a check, and he said an amazing thing too. So these are three amazing things. He said, "You're all right." He said real quick, like real quick, "You're all right." And I took the check and I said, I didn't say anything. I just looked at it and took the check, and I turned around and I started to walk away. And then he yelled at me as my back was turned. He goes, "But you'll never make it as a carpenter." And I got in my car, and those were the last words I heard from. So I was all excited about leaving him, about finishing the job. But then he told me, now this is the best carpenter I've ever seen. He said that I would never make it as a carpenter. And all I wanted to do at that point in my life was to be a good carpenter, a really good carpenter. And he just took that away in an instant. And this is when I first heard God's voice. This is the fourth voice of the week. And this is the best voice. He said, "You hear that voice? That's the voice of the Pharaoh, the one who is your enemy. He's been your enemy, your people's enemies for centuries, and he still remains your enemy. Don't listen to him. The only thing he says is lies. Note his voice, pay attention to it, but never ever listen to it." And I got in my, and I wasn't sure what that all meant. I'm not experienced at this. I don't know God speaks to people. I think this was something in the fairy tale realm, the Bible still. But he reminded me of the gnats. And then, it came to me that the gnats were one of the 10 plagues around the Israelites in the days of Pharaoh, the cruel taskmaster and oppressor. And I'm like, wow. And instantly, I felt connected to my roots as a Jew. It was weird. And yet, I never thought there was any meaning into being a Jew up to that point. And I never knew anybody. I didn't know anybody that was a believer in Jesus. I had friends that were Catholic and Baptist and whatnot, but not believers in Jesus. They never talked about Jesus on friendly terms. So I didn't know anybody who was born again. No one ever shared the gospel with me. But I felt this connection to my roots. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it had to mean something. And that was the beginning of my walk with Jesus. But I'll say this, we had neighbors, we found out, who were born again. And they told us about going to church. So we didn't know, the only church that either one of us knew about was, Catholic or a Baptist church. And I had visited a Catholic church once, and I knew that was not for us. So, but they told us about a born again church. So they were born again. They told us about being born again. And I'm reading the Bible now, and I'm realizing what born again means. So we went to this church that was so out of place for me to be. Now I'm a long-haired hippie. I had a beard down. I had a beard. I hadn't cut my hair for 10 years, or a beard. So, and that's how I lived. I didn't have good clothes, just work kind of clothes. And so we went there, and that's how I looked. But there were other people that looked like me there, which was kind of wild. I didn't expect that to be in a church. And the pastor, though, was like he just came off, the Marine Corps. He had just this real short cut hair, clean shaven with a jacket and tie on. And we were worlds apart. But when he spoke, I was on the edge of my seat. I never thought I had any connection with that generation until I heard this man speak. And he was speaking words that were spirit and life. And we were hooked. And we started going there. We didn't stop going there for 17 years until he actually retired. He was getting on. He said, you never retire as a believer, you refire. And so, but he stopped being a pastor, moved to a warmer climate. But, and we stuck, you know, we knew him and kept in touch, very close touch. He was my mentor for up until he died. And I actually wrote a book. He was a milkman when he got saved. And I wrote a book. I wanted somebody else to write it because I wasn't a writer. Certainly never thought I could write a book. Actually, I'm on my second now. But that book was called The Milkman Story because he was a milkman and he got saved in his bathroom. And he too was like very rare because there was very few. I think I could relate to you because you're a minority people as far as being a believer, because in his Long Island was like void of a Christian influence. And, you know, there was thousands and hundreds, millions of people live there that mainly came out of Europe and, you know, then moved to New York and then to Long Island. But the churches were, you know, thousands of churches, hundreds of churches, but they were all Catholic or, you know, Presbyterian, denominational, very strong. But no one was sharing the gospel. And so he got saved also, not from someone leading him, not being in a church service, but being just, his heart was for God. And he got saved taking a shower. You know, God has ways of doing things. So I knew he could work in a kitchen, work in the bathroom, he could work anywhere. And so that's been my life since then, to believe him for miraculous life, for that a life with Jesus was a miraculous life. Whether you saw what we would call miracles when you wanted to see them, well, that wasn't the point. The point was we were living in the natural, but we were people that were supernatural. So we were like secret agents, you know, of heaven. And that's how I felt myself and still do. And, you know, that's how we proceed. So, yeah, the story goes on. I became a carpenter, actually did really well, have a carpentry business in New York. And here I'm winding it down after 41 years, I think. Still going to do it, still work as a carpenter, but just to supplement income. My heart is for the ministry. My time is devoted towards ministry in Israel because I believe the Jews are called to be a light to the nations. And before they can be a light to the nations, before we can be a light to the nations, there has to be a light inside us. We, as Jesus said to his disciples, you are the light of the world. And you need to take that light with you. You need to go somewhere in order for that light to travel. But for the Jews to travel, they first have to become the light of the world. It's not, you know, it's spiritual light that God was talking about from day one. And not that it doesn't show up in the natural in ways that aid humanity and make man better and this world a better place to live in. But ultimately, the message that you read earlier from Isaiah 40, come from my people. In Hebrew, it's Nachmu, Nachmu Ami, which Nachmu finds its root in the word Noah, which is the same in English as Noah. So literally what God is saying in that verse is be a Noah, Ami is my people. Nachmu Ami, it literally means be a Noah to my people. Now Noah built an ark for the saving of the souls. It was intended to save people as well as animals. But you know the story that people didn't respond. But that was his message. That's what he preached to his people, because the only real comfort that they could have is if they found the salvation, not just from the the land that was going to be cursed with a flood. But their souls, which are going to be cursed for eternity if they refused the message that Noah preached year after year, day after day. So to be a comfort, my people, is both physical and spiritual in nature. That's the message God's calling. And that's why the only people he's talking to in the beginning of that chapter 40 is a people that receive the comfort that God is calling them to give. So it can only be for Christians, born again Christians. That's who that message is directed to. Because they're the only ones that have received true and lasting comfort. He's not talking to the Jewish people to comfort. He's not talking to Isaiah to comfort his people. He is one of his people. He is talking to some people that have yet to come, future, which you guys have embraced. So when I heard you sharing from your heart like that, I'm like, wow, you get it. Very few get it. I hate to say that, but very few get it. That this message of Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1 and 2, to, you know, Yerushalayim, speak to the heart of Jerusalem. Literally, he's saying, speak tenderly to Jerusalem, speak to their heart. You Gentile believers are the only people that can obey, can fulfill the message of Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. It's a prophetic message. And I used to think it was a command because he says it twice, comfort ye, comfort ye. But I realized it's not a command, it's a plea. It's a plea from heaven. For somewhere in the distant future, God saw, you know, because he says you received, like you said so well. He said, you have received double. They have received double from the Lord's hand for their iniquity. And I always wondered, what's the double? What's the double part? Well, the double part is that God punished them for their iniquity. But in that second part, which makes it a double, he sent them into the nations. And the nations were the Gentile. Nations means, goyim in Hebrew is nations. It means Gentile. He sent the Jews into the land of the Gentiles, out of Israel, where they were protected, where they were confined, and that was their problem. They were so consumed with themselves, they never left to bring the message elsewhere. So they became idolatrous, self-centered living. But when they went into the nations, as it happened in Babylon during Isaiah's day, Assyria in Isaiah's day, that it didn't go well for them. I mean, it went well for some of them, but no one wants to be dragged into captivity with chains. That's not going well for you. And so they knew what it was like to go into the Gentiles, but it was the second time. So when he says that you've received double, he's looking into the future as a prophet. Isaiah was a prophet. And he's telling them that they have received double from the Lord's hand. The first time was from the Lord, specifically for their sin and their disobedience. And the second time was because they were going to get it from the nations in which they landed. That was their second part, where they landed. Not that they were supposed to get it, but God knew they would get it. The way they were treated in the land of the Goyim, the Gentiles. And so for 19 centuries, they experienced, my family's experienced this hatred, which has been, you know, brief times of peace, but never times of lasting prosperity. Every single nation that they went into, they were either forced out of or executed within. And that's the history of the Jews for 19th century. So God is not commanding Gentiles to comfort ye, my people. Speak tenderly to their heart, because they won't listen any other way. And this is the sad thing. I hear this often. I haven't heard it as much lately because I don't get too much interaction lately. But people often said, why are the Jews so stubborn? Don't they read their Bible? Don't they see Jesus all over it? Can't they understand that this is all about Jesus? What or give me some verses to give to my Jewish doctor, my Jewish lawyer, my Jewish dentist. Give me something I can tell them that gets saved. And it's like magic pill, maybe. I don't know. It's probably not going to work. Why won't it work? It works for me. Why would it not work for them? I see Jesus in this. Well, if you've been accused of killing the one that you're telling them they need to be saved by, it's really a hard pill to swallow. If you're told that your people have been executed, murdered, raped, pillaged, and property stolen, and then kicked out of the country because of Jesus, it's like, he's really not that attractive, So how do they get saved then? Well, actually, what you read earlier, also quoting from Romans chapter 11, is exactly it. You provoke them to jealousy by your love for their Messiah. Your love for the Messiah, who is Jewish. It's like, do you ever get jealous? Did you ever grow up jealous of somebody? I had childhood girlfriends that liked the big guy, the big, handsome, strong guy, and didn't like me, and I wanted to kill him. I wanted to fight. I wanted to be the hero, but they just, it didn't work. I was so jealous, there was fury. Well, God is jealous. And when you show your love for him through his Messiah, who happens to be Jewish, who happens to be Yeshua, that provokes them to jealousy. It works. It really does. Because it's real. It's not just trying to put a notch on your gospel pistol to get a Jew saved and go to church. I'm not saying you do this, but people have. People go to Israel, ministries, big ministries go to Israel, and they do photo ops. They get stories, and they come back and say how they've preached the gospel to the Jewish people and how many people came to faith, etc. And, the Jews are back in Israel wondering, where was this that he did that? Where are the people that got saved at this place that he's talking about? Not that it's not happening. It is happening now. But not like they say. And they use the Jews as a platform. They use Israel as a platform to get support, to gain popularity. And so the Jews know that in Israel. And it makes them more suspicious, less envious of their Messiah, because these are the followers of Jesus that they know have created hardship. So that the new face of Jesus has to be seen. Not only has to be seen for them to get saved, but it has to be seen in order for the world redemption to end. And I think you guys know this. But before I got on the meeting, God reminded me of this one verse in the same chapter 11, which, by the way, I call this chapters 9 through 11 of Romans as the forbidden chapters. Isaiah 53 is called the forbidden chapter of Israel, of the Jewish people, because the rabbis will not go to chapter 53 of Isaiah. They won't teach from it. They won't read from it, because they say that the Christians have Christianized it. And they say that it's about the Messiah, their Messiah, when it's about Israel as the suffering servant. So they say, instead of going there and trying to go through it line by line, they just don't go there. So it's really literally called the forbidden chapter. But I think there's some forbidden chapters in the New Testament that are never taught from. And Romans 11 is definitely one, but Romans 9 through 11 in context is forbidden. I've never heard it. And I've asked theologians if they ever teach from it, and they don't. They don't teach from Romans chapter 11 because it's too controversial and too difficult to understand. And they can't spiritualize it well enough to make sense out of it. So they ignore it. And there's other chapters too in the New Testament that are forbidden. But here it says, for if their rejection, meaning the Jews, means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? That's the only place really in Scripture that gives a definition of what revival is going to look like. I mean, there's been revivals. Actually, you guys right there, especially up in Scotland, I love reading about Scottish revival because it was real. And we've had American revivals, and some were real, but some were not. And a fake revival, it doesn't look good. You know, a revival is not something we could schedule, you know, put up signs all over the town and then a tent and call for revival meetings. It just doesn't seem to work that way. I'm not saying there weren't real revivals here in America. There have been. But the real, truest revival is the one that's going to take us right to the finish line. And that will not happen until the Jews begin to come to faith in number. When this partial hardening is lifted. And it's all going to happen by the verse that comes before it. Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some. And then he goes on to say that their rejection, like you read earlier, meant mercy for the Gentiles. But how much more will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So that's why we're promoting ministry in Israel, not just to see world redemption come to an end, Jesus come and rescue us and we go off to heaven to enjoy things and everyone else, well, that's their problem. That's not what it's about. It's about loving God, just like you said earlier. Why do you love the Jews? Because you love God and God loves them. And God gives you a love for them. And so what I'm seeing all around the world, and this is what excites me about your meeting, is that there is this end time internal revival going on. It's in people. It's a revival in individuals all over the world, in the midst of isolation, in the midst of feeling like you're different from other believers because you're starting to think that there's something about the Jewish people and about Israel that's not political. It's not just because you want the world to end and you know the Jews have to do with that. Poor Jews have to go through the tribulation, but oh well, they'll get saved in the end, whoever's left, and we'll all be gone. You know, that's one prominent theology. But the theology that comes from God's heart is that this ain't gonna end until the Jew and the Gentile become one in Jesus the Messiah. Because the other forbidden chapters, not that they're forbidden to read them, but they're not taught according to the context. And I'm speaking about my experience. Ephesians chapters 2 and 3 are not taught in context of the central theme, which is the eternal purpose of God. The reason I say that is because try to find the eternal purpose anywhere else in Scripture. Now, it won't necessarily say the eternal purpose, but it will say eternal purpose of God. And, you know, there's obviously a lot of translations around, but if you look at them, enough of them, you'll see that there is no place else where it says eternal purpose as being one eternal purpose. Now, if there is only one eternal purpose, don't you think that would be pretty important for followers of God to find out? To me, this might sound naive or arrogant, and I don't mean it that way, is that if there's only one eternal purpose, I think we should start there. And we should filter everything we learn. Is this according to the eternal purpose of God? What we're learning, what we're doing? If we're deciding to do something as an outreach site, is this according to the eternal purpose of God? Now, there's a lot that has to come out of this, and I won't go into depth, and I don't want to take all your time. But to me, this has become the heart issue, is because I feel that this is God's masterpiece, and this is honing in to why we are here. It's the question that riddled my mind and puzzled me for so long, is I had no answer to that, why we're here. The eternal purpose of God is to reconcile all things to himself. But the things that he's talking about primarily are people. And we're living in a day in all over the world, but specifically in America, where we've never seen hatred like we see today. We've never seen it. And in these 2 chapters, God speaks of the most hated people in history of mankind were the Jew and the Gentile, hating each other. And he says in chapter 2 of Ephesians that he broke that hostility at the cross so that Jew and Gentile could become one new man, and thus making peace. So this one new man immediately was to be the solution to the enmity, the animosity, the hostilities that exist between people groups all over the world throughout time. The solution is right there. God wants to display it. And this is what he says. Right after that, he says, and we are, Paul is saying this, right? As the writer, as the speaker. He said, we are his workmanship. He's talking about to the Gentiles, to the Jews, we are together. Right here we are. You used to be hostile, you used to be strangers and aliens to the covenants, but we've been near, we've been all along in it, but just not embracing it in the fullest sense. So now in Jesus, we embrace this from 2 sides, from the Jewish side, from the Gentile side, and we become one. And the world sees it, and they can't believe that it's happening. Never in the known world did Jew and Gentile come together as one. And it's happening. And this is how the church began to explode. And I mean explode. Read the numbers in the book of Acts, how quickly things happen and how much love was generated between them, just as Jesus prayed. Awesome. And this is how it has to end. Otherwise, God cannot be vindicated for allowing this world to begin in the first place and for free will to come into the world, because that means we're free to hate each other. And if God gave us free will and knew we just hate each other right to the end, what in the world was the sense in living if that's how it ends? It can't end that way. It has to end on a high note. It cannot end in utter destruction. That's not how a book should end. That's why it doesn't end in the book of Malachi. When this ends, it ends glorious, and it ends, God is justified and vindicated for bringing free to this world. And you know who's the answer to it? He says we are. We are his workmanship. You know, in Ephesians 2, we are his workmanship. And it's interesting because oftentimes the way I've heard it is the preacher, the pastor, the teacher will use that as a springboard to go into the church, speak to the church, the people there, and say, and the word workmanship in Greek is poema, which means literally poem, or this incredible piece of artwork that God did. And he's saying to you, he said, you, Yah, you are his workmanship. You are his poem. You, Aziza, you are his artistry. He's created you for good works. You are beautiful in his sight. He sees this mastery in you. And that's true. That's very true. But he doesn't say that. He says we are his workmanship. It's together we are his, because the word workmanship doesn't just mean, something well crafted or a nice piece of artwork. It literally means masterpiece. And the word is only used twice. It's used right there in Ephesians 2. And the only other place it's used is in Romans chapter 1, when it speaks of the creation before the fall, that it was perfect. There was no sin. There was nothing wrong with it. It was absolutely perfect. It was his masterpiece. And that's the only 2 times that word is used. So when Jew and Gentile come together in Jesus, we are called by him, the maker, his masterpiece. And you know what? I work with a lot of artists and craftsmen, and none of them consider their work a masterpiece. They always know that there's a flaw in it. The only way that things are considered masterpiece is after the artist dies. You ever think of that? It's the same thing in God's economy, in his artwork. His masterpiece could not be created until the master, in him whom we live and move and have our being, died. He created this possibility for us to become his masterpiece. And so when we do anything less than that, we're veering off course. We need to look through the lens of his eternal purpose. It doesn't mean you have to go look for a Jew and rub him on the shoulder for good luck, so God will bless you. It means you explore what's already going on inside of you. Your heart is moving towards the Jews and to Israel, because that's where God's going. That's where his heart is. He's been pleading for mankind to come to the place of realization that all this hatred that's been generated for these 19 centuries against the Jewish people is hatred without a cause. It doesn't make sense. And because it doesn't make sense, it has to come from somewhere, just like my hatred came from for these two guys I wanted to kill that day. It comes from the devil. He wants to make us murderers because he's a murderer from the beginning. And he's had a great following, and it's got to end. So the first thing that this masterpiece does, it speaks to the forces, the demonic forces in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 9, I think it is. He says that this union of this one new man, which is one new man, it's mankind. It literally means one new humankind. It's to be a witness of the manifold wisdom of God to the spiritual forces in darkness. It's like saying for the first time, and they heard it then, it's a we mean business. Jesus said he's going to build this church. We got our tools strapped on and we mean business. Your day is done. And then there comes a day, unfortunately, I think from God's heart, it's taken too long, when the devil realizes that there is a serious body of believers who are doing as it says and doing as they're called. And they are moving in this direction, not necessarily searching under a rock for a Jew, but their heart is towards God's family in the completest sense, to like the early church was, to make this work, to make this church be all that it's intended to be. Because we've been bought with a price, and the ransom of a soul is costly. And God's out to get humanity, and there's a whole people group that are the most unreached people group, by the way, for the longest period of time in history. That's the facts. It's like, how did that happen? And that's how successful the devil is. And that's why when he starts to get wind, which he's starting, and that's what I believe all this chaos and hatred that's coming across our land is because he knows that there's a growing group of Gentiles that are taking hold of the horn of the altars and believe in God for their part to play in this last scene in redemptive history. And he is furious because he knows his time is short.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. Thank you, Paul. I want to ask you a few questions.
So I know that was in your fault.
That was fantastic. Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And you know, I just want to say this though. When I talk like this, I get people walking out on me, so I'm used to that, and I rarely do get to talk like this. Honestly, it's well, COVID has a lot to do with it, but because of the strength of replacement theology, the resistance is extremely strong. It's really deep in the hearts of the church, and I really, I'm very careful in an audience I'll speak to, because I don't want to stir up a hornet's nest. I just want to encourage people to keep going from where they are. I have ministries in Israel that when I first started trying to find, suitable ministries for us to come alongside of, the first one said to me, look, came to A&M actually to visit. And we talked, we spent some time. I met him in Israel, and I told him when he's in America, he could come visit. And he realized that there was a large sense, he was very discerning, of resistance. And it's replacement theology. That's so deep. And he was recognizing it. And I did too, and I felt terrible about it. And he said, honestly, I appreciate what you're doing. I love you. We can work together. But, I don't have time to defend the reason why I exist before I can share my message. The right to even speak. I don't have time for that. So I said, no, that's not you. That's not for you. That's me. That's my job. You don't have to do that. I'll be John the Baptist, make a way in the wilderness. But I prefer not to, after 5 years of feeling the heat of the resistance. It's so real. The devil has done so well, and you know it. If you start sharing about Jesus in your land, Ireland in Israel is known for exporting terrorists to train Hamas and Hezbollah. So you have some pretty good terrorists there. So they've arrested some. I don't know if they're in Israeli prisons or not, but they've certainly recognized and identified. But that's just to say that you are in a world of probably more unique opposition than most Christians are all over the world. So, boast in your identity, but do it in humility, because we need to win people over. We need to have conversations in order to win people over.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm learning lately.
Amen.
I need to make friends with my enemies.
Amen.
It's cool.